everyone. This is Tom Wilcox. If you haven't met me, I used to work here as a librarian. And since then, I've retired and I give all these different historical talks. And I thought this one called Garden Secret and Otherwise of New York City would be a perfect one for May because people are planting and trying to enhance their gardens or plant new ones. And what's interesting about is that you see in TV and movies and most recently in the news of the shooting yesterday in Brooklyn, uh, that you get this impression of New York City being all concrete, all asphalt, known as an urban jungle. However, there are plenty of garden areas in New York if you know where they are. And I'm going to show you, and some of them are vast public spaces where anyone can go, and others are really sort of a little remote and you just sort of happen upon them. So let's take a look and see. Now, this is actually the oldest existing building in New York City. Is the Peter Klassen Wyckoff House. The small section on the left in the picture is actually the original 1652 house. The rest of it was added later, but it is the oldest building in the city. And they recreated the kind of Dutch kitchen garden that would have been used by the Wyckoff family who lived there hundreds of years. And they often use it for school groups to teach them sort of the concept of the Dutch thing of beauty and utility. And in a way, you could say this is the oldest garden, Bowling Green. It's the oldest park in the city. It dates back to 1686. And they used it for various things. They used it for bowling. They used it as a cattle market. And one thing was in order to parlay with Native Americans, they could do that in a flat level space with no trees, no vegetation at all under the fort and its guns. And one of the things that they had was various different things that they like doing. Supposedly, according to legend, this is where Peter Minuit purchased Manhattan for $24, which I found actually was a 19th century American historian's construction. The Dutch period records from their colonization starting in the 1620s are in the State Library in Albany, and according to their records, Minuit purchased the island for 60 guilders, no more, no less. And this is, you could also say, is I call it a founder's garden because this is Stuyvesant Square, which is right about the area of East 15th Street. And he was the last Dutch director of New Amsterdam. And the director part is very important because unlike colonies that were founded like Massachusetts Bay for religious reasons or crown colonies like Virginia, New York was actually settled for commercial reasons only. It was chartered to a private company called the West India Company. And what they did is that they received permission from the Dutch government to form a commercial colony. And that's exactly what they did. But this was the northern boundary of his farm, which they call a bowery. And that's still memorialized because there's a section of the Lower East Side heading towards this area is still known as the Bowery. And this is where Peter retired after his term was over. And he, of course, had gardens. Now, this building in the background is a very exclusive Quaker school. And it's still very popular. It's been around since the early 1800s. So it's really a very, very beautiful area. And I call this a freedom garden. This is the Bowen House in Queens, in the home of the Flushing Remonstrance. And if you think Flushing sounds a little weird, it's actually from an anglicized Dutch name. It used to be called Verflushing. And the remonstrance was actually dating back to Peter because he made a prohibition that they would not allow Quakers in the Dutch colony of New Netherlands. And the townsmen of Flushing actually wrote an agreement and sent it to the director explaining in their words that they would not uh, uh, restrict them egress and will not lay their hands upon them. And it's considered to be a seminal document for our First Amendment of the basically religious freedom. Okay, well, as we progressed later on, there began to be more of a need for some sort of larger actual park for the citizens of New York. And it was a real necessity because by 1858, Manhattan, which then was still the city of New York, Brooklyn was still a separate city, uh, Queens, the Bronx, Staten Island were just a collection of villages. But uh, Manhattan Island alone had 800,000 people in the census of 1860. And it began to be very, very acute as some sort of provision of a large public area of gardens, walkways, amusements, lakes had to be designed. And this was Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux. They designed this layout of the park, which largely still exists. And it's really remarkable because it was an intense competition. They beat out 32 other submissions and they call it the Greensward design. And lately, the original plans have been going through a digitization process. And this actually helps groups like the Central Park and the Surface Conservation people because they look at the original plans because they are trying to restore parts of the park to their original 19th century appearance. And this was only the start because Calvert and Fox improved upon their design to build Prospect Park in Brooklyn. And Olmsted by himself went on to design parks in Chicago, in Boston, and in Philadelphia. So there's quite a few cities in the United States that benefited from his genius. And this is where you sort of get into more secret areas because if you didn't know where they were, you probably wouldn't know about them. And this picture on the left is actually a townhouse development called Pomander Walk. And it sort of brings a little touch of London to the Upper East Side. And it's supposed to be very, very expensive. As you see, there's not much garden area, but they make the most of what they have. And Pomander Walk actually has an interesting idea to it because what it was done, it was actually named after a musical number in a British West End production playing in New York in the 30s called Very Warm for May, which I thought was appropriate for the season. And on the right is something a little further downtown in actually on East 42nd Street. And this is a place, an apartment development called Tudor City. And they literally had to make their own park. And the buildings all surround this garden area with tulips, hedges, and it's basically supposed to be for the residents, but it's a middle of a public street. It actually, Tudor City actually overlooks the UN and all of the principal windows, living room, dining room, all the major rooms, all look down on this garden. Whereas the windows that face the UN are very small and tiny and have very limited access. And the reason is that before the UN was built, there was Consolidated Edison Electric Generating Facility and stockyards for cattle. So they sort of moved the whole view into an area, and anyone can go there. If you're ever in New York, just head east on 42nd Street towards First Avenue, and you'll run right into it. It's really terrific. You'll like it. And, with all the buildings we have in New York, the zoning laws made them set back as they got higher and higher to form terraces to allow more sunlight to get down into the street. And so older buildings like Rockefeller Center on the left here benefited from that because they were built on the site of the first actual greenhouse in America called the Elgin Gardens in the 19th century. And the gardens are actually something of a homage to Elgin and what he was doing. And on this side is actually a hotel in the East 30s on East 35th Street. And this is actually a terrace on the penthouse. So if you can ever afford the penthouse, this is what you can expect. Now, a surprising number of Manhattan restaurants managed to make some sort of a garden area. And this is actually the Waverly Inn, and the warm weather. As you can see, there's not too much space for gardens, but they do a lot of hanging plants, a lot of wall plants, just to give a garden-like atmosphere to the thing. And you'll see a lot of different, bars and restaurants and everything scattered around that in some way or other have something like that. Now, they also have interesting commercial and community vegetable gardens. This garden on the left is actually in one of the buildings of the former Brooklyn Navy Yard, which was transferred to the city and is now an industrial park when the federal government closed the Navy Yard in the 60s. And this garden is 65 acres. It's one of the largest rooftop vegetable gardens in the entire world. And as you can see, it has a beautiful view of the lower Manhattan skyline. And this picture on the right here, this is actually Randall's Island, where since the 1960s, the city has allowed community groups in vacant city land to start their own community gardens. And this is a movement that has really spread all around the country. In my town in Citrus County, we actually have a community garden where groups and individuals can rent plots and grow their own vegetables. So it's really feeding into the locavore movement of, literally from farm to table movement that's very, very popular now in this country. And that imposing structure behind them is the Hellgate Bridge, and it's called Hellgate because it was very difficult currents and rocks. And so early Dutch mariners called it the heel got. And it definitely is still very challenging. Now, there's also some memorial gardens around in New York, and this one is sort of special. This is the famous strawberry fields in Central Park. And Yoko Ono actually decided she wanted a memorial garden to her husband as close as possible to where he lost his life in 1980. And so while she had this great idea to do it, she really sort of, her memorial ship ran aground on the rocks of the city municipal art commission, the Central Park Conservancy, and a number of other stakeholders. And like the Conservancy's big problem was that They were trying to restore the Victorian look of the park, and they felt that this was not what they had in mind. And it took a while, and a lot of compromises were made, but you can actually go and see it. And if you ever go to New York, take the 8th Avenue line to 72nd Street, walk across Central Park West, and there's a path, and it'll lead you right to it. And on the right, this was actually a local neighbor. She was an activist who started a garden, a community garden. She worked on it for years and years and years. And the garden still exists, and they named it after her. And there's also quite a few church gardens here and there. This is sort of a special. The Rockefeller Foundation actually created a special area for the Metropolitan Museum in New York, and it's called the Cloisters, and it is a repository of medieval art. They have tapestries, armor, furniture, altars, you name it, they have it. And the buildings themselves are a museum piece. These are actually real medieval buildings that the Rockefellers purchased in Europe and disassembled and reassembled, showing the Romanesque, early Gothic, late Gothic look of religious architecture in Europe. And as you see, this is a typical garden you would have found in like a monastery or an abbey. And it's occasionally it's been seen on TV and in still pictures in TV ads and everything, print ads. I know they did a scene for a movie in the 40s called The Portrait of Jenny, and that was filmed there. And this is part of the garden of a church in Greenwich Village called St. Luke's in the Fields. And it was named for the apostle who was supposed to have been a physician. And the reason why is that the church members actually built that church because New York was so plagued with the diseases like typhoid and yellow fever that people who could afford to would buy a plot of land, what was then outside of the city, and build homes, summer homes, and they would stay there. And so they decided to have a church. So this way, instead of going down about a mile or so to go to church downtown and exposing themselves to all what they would have referred to as the asthma of the city, they had their own church, and so consequently has its own garden. One of the founders of this church was a man who had wrote A Visit from Old Saint Nick, Clement Clark Moore. Now, this is a very, very special garden. It's called Risen from the Ashes Gardens. And this was the winter garden built across the street from the World Trade Center. And as you can see, this is what happened to it after 9/11. So even though the general area was relatively intact and not completely destroyed by the disaster when the towers fell, as you can see, it got really, really pretty badly banged up. But it was restored. It took a lot of years. And this is how it looks today. And those are real palm trees. That's why the roofs are made of glass in order to give them the proper light. And that was a big deal because when I worked in the main library in Fort Lauderdale, we had the palm trees in the building too, only they were fake. And this is sort of interesting. And this is a lost garden. It's lost and but it's not eliminated. And this was called the garden, the tea garden in Forest Hills, Long Island. And Forest Hills was planned to be a community of palatial suburban houses that still were reachable by subway from the city. And the subway system was quite extensive. There are actually 472 stations in New York. So the one that you see on the you've been seeing on the news. It's a major transfer point for 3 different lines that can take you anywhere. But so this was a major venue from 1912 to 1968 when the restaurant that took care of it closed down. And so this is a picture of the same space today. And according to QNS, which is a Queen's newsletter, they have been really, really trying very, very hard to try and have a vision of what to do with this space. So this is still up for debate. Now, this is some of the large public gardens I've been talking about. This is actually the Brooklyn Botanic Gardens, and it's the largest botanic gardens in the city is in the Bronx. That's in New York, Botanical Gardens, but Brooklyn is still very worthwhile. And it's actually part of what we would today call a cultural complex, because there's in the apex, there's the Brooklyn Museum, and next to it is the gardens. And next to that is the main branch of the Brooklyn Public Library. And across Flatbush Avenue is Prospect Park. So you can get an awful lot of gardens in one day. And I like this. They have a number of memorials, and this was the Liberty Oaks. They were planted in May 2002. And they actually meant it as not only commemoration for 9/11, but it also said that the first generation of trees on this site were planted in November 1918 to commemorate the World War I armistice. So different generations, it keeps going on. Now, this is, I call an old family garden, because like the Wyckoffs, the Lefferts also lived here, in Brooklyn centuries. And this house is not in its original location. It was actually moved into Prospect Park, but they made a lot of effort to give it that 18th century farm look. And as you can see, Brooklyn has 2.51 million people. So it was no mean feat. In fact, actually, if you walk around this house and approach it at a certain angle, you can just see the tops over the trees of the Ebbetsfield housing project, city housing project. So it was, but they did a pretty good job, I thought. And they also have fragrance gardens. This is also in the Brooklyn Botanic Garden in 1955. They actually started the first fragrance garden in the United States. Nobody had ever done this before. And this way, especially if you're sight impaired, you don't need to see the place. You can tell what they do just by smelling them. And this one is called the Lemonade because it has a very fragrant lemon scent. And this is a new neighborhood garden that was put in my neighborhood, which is known as Bay Ridge, Fort Hamilton. And this was laid out originally in the 1930s. The WPA in the city came in and they literally built this huge park going from 69th to 101st Street. That's a couple of miles. And it's bordered by the Belt Parkway and the entrance to New York Harbor through what is called the Narrows, and has wonderful vistas of Staten Island, Verrazano Narrows Bridge. However, the original design didn't really allow for gardens. And I mean, there are playgrounds, wading pools, baseball and football fields galore, but no actual gardens. And so some neighborhood people, they got together and they said, well, we would like to have a little space for a public garden that we'll take care of. And it's called the Narrows Botanical Garden. And this is just a section of what they did. Now, this is what I'm talking about, private gardens. Believe it or not, I mean, most private gardens in the city are actually behind houses. they belong to privately owned houses. But this one's a little different. This is Gramercy Park. It was developed by a man named Samuel Ruggles. And what he was doing is that he adopted the London model of providing a park just for the residents who live around the square. And to this day, when you buy property there, you are also given a key to go into the park. It's completely surrounded by an iron fence with gates, and you just can't go in there. You can go in there as a guest of a resident. And if you're really lucky, if you get a room in the Gramercy Park Hotel, the front desk, because they are owners of property on the square. They can actually lend you a key for you to go into the garden. And so it's a really pretty area, especially in the spring. But there are always a lot of issues in these things. And New Yorkers don't particularly mince words when something really bothers them. And this is a perfect example of this. This was posted around the garden, and this said, "Your dog makes the biggest poops. We know because we've stepped in it." Now, this is interesting, tucked away garden, because literally tucked away, because you're walking down Grove Street, heading towards the Hudson River, and all of a sudden, there's this opening. Everything else is a solid line of brick or brownstones. And this is what you see. It's was constructed in the 1850s by a grocer. He thought that he could get patronage to his grocery store by building houses in the backside of his property. And these were meant to be for lower middle class working types. They're only 900 square feet per unit. And actually, that's actually larger than some of the apartments in my HOA development. They average out as something like 800, 853, I think. So they're a little larger than that. But now the current price to get in one of these is 4.2 million. It's probably even, who knows, the sky's the limit. But it is a very pretty area and it has a lot of character. And there's a lot of gardens in the various cemeteries, and in New York, especially in Queens, they have these absolutely huge ones that go on for miles, which is why they are there, because they were established because the land was cheap and available at the time. But in Brooklyn, they have Greenwood Cemetery, which is the oldest one. It actually was considered to be so beautiful when it was built that people actually were using as a park. And that's why it prompted the Brooklyn City Fathers to actually make it a real park. And nearby, you can actually walk from one to the other, is the aforementioned Prospect Park. And you can go to the cemetery in Brooklyn, and they schedule tours and special events. One of the favorite I thought was really cool was that they often give nighttime tours, and a lot of famous people of the 19th century are buried there, including the infamous boss Tweed, who was a Democratic political boss and known for his corruption. And more recently, the composer Leonard Bernstein, he's also interred there. So it's well worth the visit. But this particular is a monument to the citizens of Brooklyn. And Brooklyn at the time was the fourth largest city in the United States. They contributed quite a lot of men in their effort to preserve the Union. And this is the monument with the plantings dedicated to them. And some townhouses are very lucky to still have their gardens. And this is the front of this house on Willow Place in Brooklyn Heights. And this is the back. And now the back was originally meant to be an area where, you kept your horses, you kept the laundress would work, all the necessary things to manage a house were actually done in the back. And as a piece of literary history, down here in the basement, Truman Capote lived for a while. He knew the owner at the time, and so you never know where you're going to see some sort of a literary reference in New York. And this is something you can't have a garden in New York without something being haunted. And this is the backyard garden of a museum known as the Old Merchant's House. And it was built in 1831 by a family named Treadwell, and they lived in it until 1932. The last of the Treadwell children left it to the city, and it's haunted because they believe the house is haunted. Various things have happened to people, and actually, sometime down the road, I'm planning to do a series on haunted New York, and I'll tell you more about it. But supposedly, one of the daughters was denied marriage to a Roman Catholic and supposedly starved herself to death in her room. And some others believe it was also the last occupant, Gertrude Treadwell, and none of the five Treadwell children married. So who knows what could have happened. And this is a beautiful area in Midtown. It's the Ford Foundation, and you've probably heard of the foundation. It's was established by the Ford Motor Company, and they're a philanthropic thing. And they built this headquarters in the 60s, and they decided to not just have an atrium, they decided to actually make it an atrium garden. And this is very unusual. It's open to the public, and anyone can go in there, and it's absolutely beautiful. But it took a lot of effort uh, with gardeners, architects, everybody trying to get that. And it's just a great place to sort of get yourself away from the din of the city because it is a pretty busy area. And this is a tribute garden to Frederick Law Olmsted. And this was put in Riverside Park, which he also designed. And it's got different kinds of plantings that he normally chose in his career. So it's quite interesting to go and see. Now, Central Park, in a way, just to show you what a masterpiece Central Park is, this on the left was where Central Park is now. It was a shanty town on the east side known as Dutch Hill. This is what they had to clear away in order to make this. This is a portion of the park known as the Ramble. And the Ramble was designed to have all of these paths going up and down and steps and fountains and pools. And all of this was created literally out of this. And it's a great area, supposed to provide the illusion of taking a walk in the countryside in the Catskill Mountains without having to go there. Now, of course, today the illusion is rather ruined because there are skyscrapers surrounding it, but it still is a great place to go to. And this is a rather unique thing in New York. This was once a brownstone, and when they tore it down, um, the Paley Foundation, which ran CBS for many years, they donated, they bought it, and they developed this park. And it's actually a very, very small space because average New York City row house is generally 20 feet wide and maybe 40 feet back. And in order to give this illusion of space and the dead noise, they actually have a fake waterfall. And it's actually piped in. And actually, this was pioneered in Central and Prospect Parks. When you see these little streams rushing by you on the path. If you go to the right spot, you're going to suddenly see a pipe coming out of the rock. So it's a great place to spend because there's really nothing there. I mean, it would be quite a walk to get to Central Park. So there are too many other areas. This is definitely one of them. Now, of course, New York was very involved in the American Revolution, and I call these founding father gardens. And here's why. This is the garden area of the Moore Shumel Mansion. This is actually the oldest existing building in Manhattan. It was built around 1764, and George Washington used it as his headquarters. And inside we actually Aaron Burr lived there for a time because later on after the revolution his second wife was the widow of Shumel himself. Her name was Betsy, and so he lived there for a while. And you know, by their standards they were actually quite wealthy because Betsy, one of the things she managed to snag that you could still see in the house is a bed that belonged to one of Napoleon Bonaparte's brothers. And on this side is Hamilton. It's called Hamilton Grange. And this was the country home for Alexander Hamilton. He only actually had 2 years to enjoy it as he was killed in a duel with Burr. And this house has had a really interesting history because it's actually was moved twice from its original location. First in the 1880s, and they decided to move it again in 2009. There was a particular reason for it because it was literally wedged between an apartment building and a church. And they realized that there was a small park around the corner. So they had to jack up this huge, big old house and somehow angle it around the corner. And some of you around here know how complex this was because of moving the Morris house. And basically, this was roughly about the same degree of magnitude of task. But as you can see, this looks exactly like how the Hamiltons would have lived there. We also have what I call a literary garden. This is actually the Poe Cottage in the Bronx. And this was actually moved from its original location. But the reason why it's associated with Poe is that Poe's wife, Virginia Clem, was very ill with what was called consumption, which is now tuberculosis. And he wanted to get her out of the city because the city was extremely dirty. As I said, they had problems in the summer, typhoid and malaria. And also, the only street cleaning that existed were wild pigs that ran around town and just pretty much ate whatever they felt like. And that was street cleaning. There's a famous pig that was trotting around that had a sign on it said, "I'm Patty O'Doyle's pig. Whose pig are you?" So Poe brought her up there. He didn't have much money. And in those days, authors didn't really make very much money. They literally sold their work piecemeal. They got maybe $20 for whatever they wrote. If they were lucky, other authors achieved fame, like Dickens in England, by being serialized in magazines. So every week or every month, there would be another chapter of the story. And so Poe really didn't make very much, and he couldn't afford much. But all of this was in vain. Virginia died, and he supposedly wrote the poem dedicated to Annabel Lee in this building, and you can actually go and see it. And also, we have a rather unique thing in Central Park. It's a theatrical garden, and in it, are all the plantings of all the things mentioned in Shakespeare's plays. And on this thing is from A Midsummer Night's Dream. And it said, quite over canopied with lush woodbine, with sweet musk rose and eglantine. And this is all in his plays. And the reason why this garden is there is that it's right next to the Delacorte Theater, which actually provides free Shakespeare in the park. It started in the 1960s. They built the theater for it, and you can still go and see it today. And you can see the garden, and you can see a play for free. And even some famous people, people who are now famous, like Meryl Streep, actually did a stint in the public theater, Shakespeare in the Park. So it's definitely worth checking out. Now, I call this an unexpected garden because this looks a lot better than you would think. This is actually the garden to the IKEA store, and it borders the Gowanus Canal, which is a certified Superfund site, and they're working to clean that up. And this is IKEA's way of trying to make it, and it's growing back. They're developing along the canal. The canal is getting cleaner. People are actually kayaking on it. And this beautiful garden on the west side is actually built above a parking garage. Rather unusual that. You would never guess it, would you? And this is what I call an up in the air garden. This is something called the High Line, and it's rather interesting. It ran along 10th Avenue, and it ran through all the industrial buildings. And the reason why they did that was that before it was built in the 1930s, railroad trains would run directly on 10th Avenue, and it was known as Death Alley because of collisions with cars, wagons, pedestrians, and a lot of people died. And they actually had men on horseback coming before the trains to warn people that a train was right behind them, and they were known as 10th Avenue Cowboys. So I come from a strange and mystical place. So what they did was that they built a railroad line above the streets. And so this way the cars could do their thing, serve the buildings around them. And one of the buildings is the National Biscuit Company. So if you like Malamars, that's where they were born. One of the most interesting things about it is that all of the plantings were actually native to New York City and area, and the whole island used to be covered in things before it was developed. So it's a good way of bringing some of our past back. And this is rather interesting. We have some touches of Asia in some of our gardens. This is the Marquise Tibetan Center in Staten Island. And it's not that easy to get to. You have to take the ferry or drive across the Verrazano Bridge and either take a bus or drive there. It's definitely worth the trip. It's a beautiful garden, and it has a museum of Tibetan art, artifacts, religious artifacts, and it's nothing quite like it. And this is interesting because one of the things they have in Prospect Park and Brooklyn Botanic Gardens area are cherry trees. So instead of having to go to Washington to see the cherry trees, you can actually, if you happen to be in New York in the springtime, you can actually go there and see them. And this is a library garden. This is adjoins this Romanesque revival courthouse. It was built as a courthouse in 1876 in Greenwich Village. And this beautiful area, believe it or not, was once the home of the New York City Women's House of Detention. And that's where women would be arraigned in the courthouse and kept there until they could be brought to Rikers Island. And this is what was where the garden was. You could the building the courthouse is still here. It's actually now a branch of the New York Public Library, and it's definitely worth seeing. The reference room is where the jail cells were. But as you see, this rather grim building. Its most famous resident was actually the actress Mae West, because back in the 1920s, all scripts to be produced in the city had to be given over to the NYPD, and they would check it for prurient material. And she appeared in a play where they told the producers not to produce this play. It was salaciously entitled Sex. And when they did, the theater was raided and the entire cast was arrested and put on trial. And Miss West was here for a while, and they say she was treated very well with kid gloves, and it was really more of a show trial, and they slapped them on the wrist with the light fine and everything, but it made that show the hottest ticket in town and was one of the things that definitely launched her on her movie career. And they have a unique holiday garden in the Bronx, New York Botanical Garden in the Bronx. They always have this huge Christmas garden and train display. And as you can see, here's the Brooklyn Bridge, and here's Darius City, here's a little train, here's the stock exchange. So they're very whimsical, and every year they have something different. And we're back in Brooklyn again. This was, I call it a revolutionary garden. This is a reconstruction of the old stone house of Gowanus, which was built in 1698 and torn down in the 19th century. However, when they decided to develop a playground and park there, they actually found as many of the original stones still on the property. So some of this structure is actually original stones. But what makes it a revolutionary garden is that in the Battle of Brooklyn, Washington's army was literally saved by a Maryland regiment who took a stand at this house and delayed the British long enough for our army to get to the Brooklyn Heights. And actually, sometime we may deliver. I have another program called The Lost Battle That Won the Revolutionary War. And it's all about how important this battle was, which has somehow been lost to history. Now, they also have a few gardens that were once private estates and now they're public gardens. This is a perfect example. This was built by a wealthy industrialist called Wave Hill in the Bronx, and it overlooks the Hudson River. It's absolutely beautiful estate. It's 28 acres, and they have all these, structures, garden structures, seats. They have an art center. They have a museum. They have a number of events in the warm weather, and the gardens are really beautiful. And here's something rather. This is gardens that are here and still not here. This is one that's here. This is actually in Brooklyn. Here's the Brooklyn Heights. This is the Brooklyn Queens Expressway. And this park, which once were piers, actual shipping piers. And what they did is that they made it into a public park because there really are no real parks. The closest thing they have to a park in Brooklyn Heights is right here. It's called the Esplanade, and you has a breathtaking view of lower Manhattan, and the traffic literally runs underneath it. And this huge berm was built as part of mitigation for rising seas and climate change that New York has been working very, very hard to try and ameliorate. Now, this one on the left is actually a concept drawing because the High Line has given inspiration for another park, and this is called the Low Line. This was formerly the trolley car barns that took streetcars over the Williamsburg Bridge into Brooklyn, and they hope to develop it to have an indoor garden space. So I hope that they can do that sometime. And this is a restored garden. This garden goes back to literally 2008. A man named Sam Aiken, a gardener, he actually started grafting and planting trees and doing research and writing to a whole bunch of people. And what he was trying to do is restore fruit trees that were once very common in New York City and that have since been lost to climate change and urban development, mostly urban development, because especially Manhattan, because Manhattan, which was very hilly, was actually leveled. I mean, it was just totally flattened out in order to build more and more buildings, avenues, elevated train lines, subways. And this is a picture on Governor's Island. This is actually grown, and Governor's Island is a city park that's actually from the foot of Manhattan. You actually have to take a ferry to get to it, but it's not that far. You can actually see it from the tip of Manhattan. That's how close it is. And this has grown to 120 trees. And what the game plan is that they will be actually shared and spread throughout the entire city so that everyone in New York has the opportunity to have fruit that has been lost and is now restored. Now, you're sort of wondering, okay, well, I've never been to New York and I sort of like the idea of the gardens. Can I find it? And there are ways to find it. This is actually a standard mapping thing that you can find anywhere you have internet. If you just type in New York City gardens on the mapping feature, they show you, like they have the New York Botanical Garden up here. They have all these little gardens. Here's the Brooklyn Botanic Garden. Here's the Queens Botanic Garden. And what's great about it is that they give you reviews and they tell you its location where you can find it. And you can't go wrong. That's a great way to actually locate a garden, and you could map out your entire trip before you even go. And also the gardens themselves have websites, and I urge you to look at them because pretty much all of these gardens are accessible by public transportation, because unless you're used to it, I would not drive in New York City if I could help it. And now I know some of you may have a little hesitation about taking the subway right now, but normally it's very safe. And in this case, this is for Brooklyn. If you want to go to, you could take the 2 or 3 train to Eastern Parkway, Brooklyn Museum, and walk. You can take the B, Q, or S train to Prospect Park, and you could take the 4 or 5 to Franklin Avenue, and that's just by subway. And by bus, they give you 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 bus lines to get there. And they even tell you how many minutes it is to get to a garden entrance and where they are. Like the B16 goes to Lincoln Road. And one thing is that all the buses have a call sign for the borough. All the Brooklyn buses are B, all the Manhattan buses, the Bronx buses are BX, the Queens buses. So they're all coded so you know basically where they belong. And also, you could also look at blogs or video logs called vlogs. And there's a lot of them on YouTube. And like is from, these are from spring at Wave Hill. These are all Wave Hill ones. And you could just see a whole bunch of them. They give you short descriptions. They give you an idea where it is on the map. You can go to floor plans, you can go to events, images. So there, you can get a lot of information on the internet about how to get to these parks. And that's the end. Here is another picture of Wave Hill, one of the pools, and you see the river right here. And hope you enjoyed this program going down to visit some of New York's secret and otherwise gardens. Thank you very much.